Duke University Press, the volume to decisively demonstrate how multi-species ethnography reframes pursuits of justice! Exclamation point. Congrats and thanks to editors Sophie Chow, Karen Bollender, and Eben Kirksey, also on Twitter, and a bunch of co-authors. Very convenient because then I can follow all the co-authors too. There, you can order it right from there. So look at how happy and excited she is. And she's got it turned to the page in the book. Very exciting. Fun. Pinned tweet. Liz, what's that? Beautiful crop duster. You know these? Aren't they beautiful? Just making a nice little dusting, getting rid of all the bad things under those. Yeah, which are great, except, well, Liz, there might not be so great. Where? Yeah, on those Philippines banana plantations where they're dusting the crops and hitting a few other things too. Actually, this reminds me that this is kind of like, I forgot about this possible connection to our last chapter on rights of the Amazon, is that this was one of the complaints of the people when they were subjected to the war on drugs as aerial spraying from above of coca plants. They would get on everything and just spray whole zones of the Amazon to get rid of the coca plants, but you'd be getting rid of all kinds of other things too. So, Anna, what are you supposed to do here? You have a crop duster flying through. What are you supposed to have? Yeah, you're supposed to have a buffer zone. There, Canadians know how to do it. The government of Canada says you need that buffer zone. You spray there. Look, there's that. That's a tractor sprayer. That's not an airplane. That's just a tractor or a truck or something. Canadian vehicle. And then you have your buffer zone, and then the water stays good. Very nice, especially if the wind is going. You don't even need a buffer zone. If it's upwind habitats, you got the wind blowing the right direction, says the Canadians. It's fine. So you need a buffer zone, and they are regulated to have buffer zones, but what happens? Do they do it?
No.
Not usually. Usually they don't. Yeah. So then they tried to create their own buffer zone. How's that work, Jacob? They working on getting those buffer zones in there?
Well, they try to, but it takes away from the spaces of land. And the government mandates that they have them, but they don't check. They're going to care. So.
Yeah, doesn't really work. So the people and their stuff gets sprayed. Of course, if you have a buffer zone, then what are those, Mickey?
They're like the animals that will get sick before humans do, and I don't like that. I check on the environment as well.
Oh, I feel sad laughing about this. You said it was not very nice of us to rely on these things. Sentinel species. The animals and plants that help us keep an eye on the environment because they die all the time. And then we're like, oh, careful. Yeah, this was kind of a strange thing. Well, you said it wasn't very nice of us to do this.
Yeah, but it's kind of like, it's weird because I mean, you kind of need to like gauge how well the environment is doing with human practicing involved. But like, if you just miss the first sign and let everything else start dying, it's kind of like on us.
Yeah, you said it was kind of like a trolley problem.
Yeah. There's a lot of ways to look at it, and both ways there's negatives and both ways there's positive. It's kind of it's confusing.
It's confusing. Yeah, I guess that's the promise of multi-species justice is, do we just let these guys die so we can save ourselves? That doesn't seem very nice. The canary in the coal mine is the classic example, so we can get out, but the poor canary, why does the canary always have to die? That doesn't seem very nice. I mean, I guess you need to, in an ideal world, they're helping us out by letting us know and sending us signs and flopping around or whatever they need to do, and we're like paying attention. Yeah, I got this from it was a magazine, no, a journal called C&N, which makes it sound cool, but it's yeah, it makes it's weird. I couldn't figure out what it was. It's the chemical and engineering news. I guess C&EN sounds cooler than that, but you know, if you subscribe to this, you can meet the sentinels. Also, this reminded me, remember when we were reading Moran of the Arctic as like a early warning zone, and the high altitude is an early warning zone? I think I made the same comment. Why do we have to have these poor early warning zones? All the people are like, hey, you're messing up. Anyway, yeah, if you have a nice buffer zone though, then these sentinels can tell you that something is wrong. Now, I just want to say that this doesn't just happen in the faraway Philippines. It has happened periodically in places closer to home. In fact, here's an article in Science about something that, you know, just a little bit ago, when people are debating the scientific claims of, you know, whether or not we can spray pesticides on stuff. And as Paredes puts it on page 94, if you follow the chemical science and the regulations and the ways in which you have to prove things, people try to make you prove that this caused that there's a cause and effect relationship between whatever is being sprayed or whatever is being used and a specific form of illness. And if it's more general, it's very difficult to prove. So there are some cases in which this has been a pretty easy connection, and you say, aha, we got this, which causes that. But things that happen years down the road, slow moving effects, much more difficult to prove. And I don't know if you picked up on this, but why would it be very difficult to prove cause and effect between the single pesticide and the health effects in the Philippines where they're doing the spraying? Why would it be particularly hard for these folks to prove this? Yeah, Cass. They use so many pesticides, they don't know which one to target. In fact, it's a secret, right? They don't tell you which ones because you're supposed to come up with this mix and match. So, because you don't want the bugs to evolve, right? So it's kind of like, you know, when pesticides first came out, it was like when, what's that stuff we have? Penicillin. It was like that stuff. Man, it was great. It was just cleaned up everything, worked beautifully. Now, as you know, you go into the doctor's office and they're like, yeah, you need these super duper antibiotics because we got to keep up with the evolution. We got to keep up with the bugs, got to keep up with the bacteria. Same things happen in pesticides, is that initially it was like a miracle, and then pretty soon the bugs start evolving. Next thing you know, they're resistant to some of these things. So at first they just started spraying more, you know, blast them harder, faster. Right? And then they're like, wait a second. No, that's just going to make them evolve better. So now they have this secret cocktail mix. You do one thing one day, and then you hit them with another thing. So they can't ever know what's coming. But the problem is, if you're a human being living under this, it's very difficult to prove that it's doing any harm to you. Very difficult to make that scientific connection. Now, as we saw in the pinned tweet from Alyssa Paredes, what she went to do was what anthropologists and these folks, or the pioneers of this, are trying to call a multi-species ethnography. So in the old days, anthropologists went and we just studied the human beings because that's what anthropology is, the study of humans. But now what we're supposed to be doing in a multi-species approach is to go beyond the human beings, all these entangled worlds. And, you know, we'd like to see that people are involved, entangled in their ecosystems, and we know this, and everybody's entangled with not only human beings, but non-human beings as well. But Alyssa Paredes goes to the Philippines and she finds that the people have some slogans because they can't, you know, they want to defend their environments too, but the problem is they need a slogan that's going to stop the aerial spraying, stop it so when they're riding your bicycle out to the field, you don't get blasted by a crop duster. So their slogans were, "I am not a banana." It's always a good slogan to have because you don't want to be sprayed as if you were a banana. I like that. I am not a banana, and we are not pests. I am not a banana. We are not pests.
Morning affirmation.
Huh?
Morning affirmation.
Yeah, I mean, these are good. I mean, you know, it's sad that you have to say these. But, well, Louis, what's the problem with these slogans?
Well, I had the idea that like these populations are so like entrenched in the idea that like they need to go and be like ethnically distinct from like animals and have their crops be protected, but meanwhile they're protesting in favor of like how they don't want to be considered like part of this problem. So
I am not a banana and we are not pests. Exactly. And as Paredes put it, yeah. I mean, you know, the issue with that slogan is, well, fire away at the pests, but don't hit the humans. So, you know, if you have the slogan, "We are not pests," then, you know, it basically says, well, it's okay to blast the pests away as long as humans are left unharmed. Now, I think they would also want their own stuff to be left unharmed as well, but you can see why they kind of need that slogan or adopt such a slogan in a situation in which it's very difficult to prove this sort of specific harm being done from the ever-shifting cocktail. But yeah, cocktail, that doesn't sound very, that sounds nicer than a pesticide cocktail. Now, as Paredes says, in these slogans, there is an insistence on not being a banana, not being a pest, an insistence on seizing being a human being. Anaya, why would they have this insistence on being human? What would give them that idea? Or what are they fighting against, I would say? Yeah. So the insistence on being human is very deeply rooted in a colonial experience that they've been through and are living through, which is that many times a classic thing that colonizers and others have done is deny people their humanity, to put people into the category of the animal and to stress their animality in relationship to the colonizer's humanity. And so for people who have been constantly threatened and placed in this category, there is this legacy, which is to say a history of people doing this to them, and also a constant threat of being dehumanized. And she gives us a couple examples. She talks about, you know, how this plays out in a racialized landscape, and it happens all the time in our own country, which is the idea that some people are supposed to be able to eat and others are fit to be eaten. And I would just say, whenever you are tempted to make any sort of comparison across the human to animal worlds, just be careful. Watch out. Because so many people have been placed in this, the category of animality. And so we might say, doesn't matter. You can have, people collect this stuff. You can buy books on how much worth it's to have people as bottles and people as objects and these kinds of things. Don't do it. Don't collect objects like this. Don't try to be aware of this history in which people have been transformed or tried to put into this category. It is a big deal. It really does matter to people. So what happens? They're protesting, take this case to court. And the rights of the Amazon, they won, remember? The avant-garde judge gave him a big victory. What happens here? I guess I should say, I guess that. They lose. They lose the case. Well, yeah, that was a different, the avant-garde judge they won, although it wasn't really the people in the Amazon, and it had some strange after effects, but at least they won. Here they just lost. It was pretty sad. Oddly enough, though, while they lost the case in the Philippine Supreme Court, under the weirdest of grounds, I have to say, it just was maddening. But the other part that happened is that there were other places, other provinces of the Philippines where they actually did ban aerial spraying. Now, wait a second here. You have all these people protesting, I am not a banana and we are not pests, and they lose. But then in other places, they just tell them not to spray anymore. Why? Yeah, John.
It's like that the only outcome is like only the two extremes. There isn't really a middle where they can. Sounds like the court systems are not really having they're not designed to have a more nuanced determinant factor. It's either it continues or it doesn't.
That's interesting, and that actually sounds kind of like our last chapter as well, right? That's what our last author Lyons was arguing about the Colombian court system, is you can't just live in the abstract up there in the heavens and issue your sentences down and then be like, oh, hey, that's not my job. That's the job of policymakers. So that's true. The courts do live in this sort of abstraction, but there's a reason. Here they have these provinces where nobody was, well, maybe somebody was protesting, but it wasn't, the provinces where they were protesting, they lost the case and they threw it out of court on equal protection clause. It was, again, maddening. But in other provinces, they actually banned the spraying. Why? It's actually a very simple, but also kind of maddening reason. What did those other provinces have? Go for it.
Money.
Well, a form of money. They had some other stuff. What were they doing with the money? Yes. Go for it.
Better crops, maybe?
Better crops. No, they had bananas. They had another thing, though. Huh. Deep into the chapter. Oh, wait. The conclusion. Yeah, I always have to read it. What did the other provinces have that got this banned? That's where they were also had chickens, pigs, and cattle. So in these other places where people had not just banana plantations, but they were raising chickens or raising pigs or raising cows, they were able to ban aerial spraying because they said, you're messing with our livestock. And then on the irony of ironies, I guess, one of the protesters say, here in Davao, all we have are people. So it's like if we would have had some chickens, we would have been okay. But since we don't, we're just people, we lost, which kind of sucks. So yeah, this was a sad one. So Paredes doesn't give up, though. They can't give up. Nobody can give up. So now what? So if we go back to our original idea, she kind of says that if people say we are not pests, then as we've talked about, or as she says, then people continue to be vulnerable, or she would say, since pests are so unquestionably subject to extermination. So if you say I am not a pet, no, if you say I am not a banana and we are not pests, the problem is you're still setting up this category of the pest. And everybody agrees that we have to get rid of pests. We're just finding the right way to do it. We all agree that pests have to be stomped out. And so that's the problem, is that the issue is if we say we are not pests, then this process can continue. Tyler, what does Paredes say we should do in this situation?
Well, she mentioned that, like, providing, like, appropriate the species that get excluded.
Yeah. What should we do with the pests?
Justice.
Well, yeah, I guess sort of. Yeah, I mean, she says that the figure of the pest is ripe for reclaiming. The figure of the pest is ripe for reclaiming. Why are you guys laughing? You don't want to reclaim the pest?
Not particularly, not in my place.
It's not ripe for reclaiming?
It depends on what the pest is. If it's like a house spider, I don't mind a house spider.
There you go. The house spider is ripe for reclaiming.
I don't want any roaches.
You don't want to reclaim the roach.
Yeah, house.
I don't know. Mickey? Yeah, I mean, I don't think she's trying to say, she's not trying to get as specific as spiders and roaches here. She's saying the figure of the pest, right? The idea of the pest is ripe for reclaiming. We need to reclaim the pest. Yeah, I don't know. Here's the last sentence. I can think of no better words to cry out and no better imaginary to labor toward than we too are pests. So instead of saying we are not pests, the new slogan is going to be we too are pests. I don't know. This might not be completely fair. Maybe she's not saying that this should be a slogan, but I'm just going to go with it for a second. Is this going to work? Yes, he seems skeptical.
Even if you're like redefining the term and including people in pests, don't think anybody really wants anything to do with pests.
Yeah, I mean, I want to believe it. I want to believe that the figure of the pest is ripe for reclaiming. Just, I can't get there. I don't know. I don't think this is going to work. I'm not sure. Does anybody think this is going to work? Can I get anybody to reclaim the pest for me? Just having trouble here, but I'm ready for somebody to argue against me. This is like bonus territory. If you can argue for reclaiming the pest, this is like you get out of your final presentation, which I've already gotten you out of. All right, John, you ready?
Yep.
Okay, go for it.
All right. So considering the idea of a pest is considered based off of like cultural history, like if you think of medieval times, a pest were considered rats, and a lot of the time the rats weren't very much of the issue. It was more of the lack of the knowledge that we would have been able to not have them around as pests. And I think it's because of like the faults of like particular like housing or whatever particular like communities that have like poor income that experiences more, but more distribution of the term pests. We can definitely see, like, if you go to a rich person's house, you're not gonna see a pest. It's very unlikely you're gonna see like any small form of pestery. I think that the only reason why pest really exists is because it mostly provides from the idea of there is of having an animal being around the house is conceived like an unnatural state. Oh, you see like when you see a house, you don't think of like seeing an animal live there, which is kind of weird because we have pets. But when we think of pests, we think of, oh, the animals are not wanted there. So I think like what she means by like the figure of the pest, I think she means of like to actually start with that change. I think we need to go back into the cultural origins of why pets were considered pests and really understand the fundamental roots of like mostly of like the lack of resources we had at that time and what we could make the standard of what is we can improve the standards of just a traditional person or like any other person in the try to improve like healthcare and like many different forms and eventually the idea of having a rat like you'll see like a rat nearby the hospital won't be inside the building but rather it'll just be in this outside. I think that's why pests is mostly hard to reclaim because certain pests you don't want to have because they carry diseases. But the only reason of why those diseases were prevalent in the first place was because the lack of like management and the lack of like cause and effect. I mean, like 100 years ago, people thought that when you put like a bag or like a cloth over a meat, they think that that the worms came or like flies came from the rotting meat rather than the flies coming towards them. So I think it's all about how we perceive things, and I think if we would to have the figure of the pest be reclaimed, I think that having the first statement of "we too are pests" is a good statement. That's a good like push forward, and then we also have to reconcile what we are. We basically have to reshape of what is and what is not. Might be a little unrealistic, but
Well, I mean, I guess I think I can see what you're saying intellectually. I think I can see it as sort of, okay, I'm gonna rethink my house. And if a rat runs by, I'm not gonna freak out. No, I can't do that. I can't. I might be able to reframe my intellectual history. I'm just wondering to what extent I can put this on a billboard or hold up a sign and somebody's gonna be, it's gonna move people.
support non like
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, maybe before she says this, she uses the words of Clapperton Chakanursa Mavunga has powerfully declared, quote, to call them pests is to acknowledge their resistance or that they simply moved about in ways the colonial regime saw as resistance. So maybe, I guess, reclaiming the figure of the pest for human protest and for human resistance is might be hard. Let me see if I can argue for it. All right, I'll try this one. It's just on the spot. I wasn't going to argue for it, but I'll try this. I am not a banana and we are not pests were powerful slogans, but they obviously didn't work. Now, one could say, well, it's not because of the slogans, it's because of the stupid Supreme Court and the laws and people being unjust to each other. So that was my initial impulse, is to say, it's not the slogans, it's the laws and stuff like that. So who cares if we reclaim the figure of the pest or not, because it doesn't matter, it's the laws and stuff that have to change. However, let's say you're in this situation. You're still in this situation, and you just got this stupid ruling from the Supreme Court of the Philippines. Maybe, just maybe, I mean, have we seen, there is a certain power to like using the comic or the the exaggerated in the protest. So maybe if they start walking around with signs that say, we too are pests, it's going to draw even more attention and more like people to talk about like the situation. I don't know. Maybe it could work. It could work maybe in a situation in which you got very little other alternatives. Tori?
I think that there's like that video that you showed us that was like, we are the virus, humans are the virus.
Mm.
So maybe they're using it in that sense. Because kind of we are like messing up the environment and the earth, and like doing all this bad stuff, which is what we think that the rats do for us. So we're just doing it to like on a bigger scale and we don't realize it.
Reclaiming the virus. Yeah. Well, anyway, it's something to think about. I don't know. I'm not sure. I wasn't convinced of this. It might work. Not sure. Huh. All right. Our next author was much more difficult to find on Twitter. But through Paredes' Twitter account, I did find her. Hard to find a picture of her. That's the best I could do. Elizabeth Lara, who was writing to us about prison gardens and growing abolition. She did not have this as her pinned tweet. She did retweet some cool stuff, though. She retweeted this thing about, I don't know if you know this, but California right now. Are there any Californians here? There are no Californians. Okay. I don't know if you know this, but California right now is in something they call a it's a super bloom, where all the wildflowers are going crazy all at once. And you know, it's not just because it happens all the time, it happens like every so often that you get this confluence of wildflowers. So, you know, that's kind of exciting, and it's really amazing, apparently, if you're there. But this person is saying, hey, don't just go cartwheeling and taking selfies in the wild super bloom, because you're going to trample the freaking super bloom, and then it's going to not be good for all the native pollinators, which is what we want to have happen. Oh, are any of your, do any of you participate in the No Mow May?
What?
Has anybody heard of No Mow May?
Oh, like lawn mowing?
Yeah. Well, you can go tell your families about this then.
Yeah, I'm not a homeowner, so.
Yeah, I know. That's what I know you. That's why I was I was searching for, I don't want to say, you know, your parents, but I'm thinking that it might be, you know, that generation that they're going to participate in No Mow May. It's kind of this new movement coming, sweeping the country right now, where you just let things go for the whole month of May.
The popularity is growing.
You can go to the that was good. You can go to the Otsego site, and they'll give you a sign. No, they won't give you a sign. For $25, you can put up a sign in your lawn that says No Mow May, and that'll let your neighbors know that you're not just being an ass and letting things go to seed. That you have a reason for doing it, which is to let the native pollinators come in and do their thing. So I was about to do this because I'm lazy, but my problem is when I'm mowing the lawn, I use a push mower. I don't use one of those gas or electric things. And if I do No Mow May, I'm not going to even be able to mow it. It'll be far gone. And I also looked this up, and it turns out most of the people that do No Mow May, since they haven't planted native plants in their yards, are just seeding the place with dandelions. And dandelions are fine, but they're not native. They don't really help the native pollinators. And apparently, at least from what I've read, if all the dandelions go to seed, then the guy down the road is going to be like, what is all these dandelions growing? And he's going to spray his lawn like extra good with the chemicals. So I don't know. It's just hard to tell if no Mow May is actually a good idea. I'm trying to get rid of the dandelions. That was my most recent objective in my lawn. Yeah. Yeah, I think you can actually plant violets. You can tell your homeowner people to put violet plugs in, because violets are actually native and they only grow up a little bit, and then you can mow over the top of them. Yes, John.
I think no, that's a weird,
It's a weird slogan.
no, it's like a
We
weird-
too are pests. No mow May.
No moment. I think it could work in smaller smaller more like urban areas where they have like barriers of like each like lawn and property, so you can have like typically like a square foot of like housing. You can like maybe take cut like a little bit like a quarter up and have that be fully grown while still mowing the rest. But like when you have property like my case where it's like half of like a big open field and we still mow it regardless, even if it isn't ours, because we own like nearby a farm, we can't just simply let that grow up. Even if we do have those electric mowers too, and we wouldn't be able to get all that up because it's right next to a field where there's like wheat and I know it's corn and mostly it's like corn and wheat.
You gotta
So I
spray
couldn't-
that stuff, man.
Well,
Yeah.
they don't mostly spray like in our lawn, they mostly spray nearby in the area, so.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
we do have like a little tiny corner where it does, we just let it grow out and let the pollinators.
Yeah, no, you can do that. I was just asking. Anyway, she also retweeted this. This is hard to read. This was like a little beautiful community garden. And somebody says that apparently someone with decision-making power decided to dismantle this beautiful little garden, previously located on public housing property. That's just mean. You know, people do try to make these little areas like John was talking about. They try to beautify them and make them great, and then somebody comes along and says, no, can't do that. Anyway, this article is about something that we're also number one in. As I like to be, I always like to be number one. I forgot what we were number one in before. I don't remember what we were number one. The United States, we're number one in.
Mental illness diagnosis.
I know, in this class. Was it cars?
Like automobiles. Like
Automobiles, yeah, something like that. Parking lots.
Commercial zoning.
We're number one. What are we number one in?
Nothing.
Incarceration rates. Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I got this off of Wikipedia, of course. It's one of the most unbiased sources. And this is the closest country that comes to us in terms of OECD countries is Turkey. They're not even very close. Israel, Chile. I mean, look at the UK. Actually, they're the ones that give us no mow May. It's a movement from the UK. They're way down there. We're way up there. We have a lot of people incarcerated. What does it say? All but 4 US states have a higher incarceration rate than Turkey, the nation with the second highest incarceration rate. So almost every state is also higher.
I think there's a reason for it. How do you think the government makes free license plates and like bags, potatoes?
There is a labor component to this for sure. There is definitely a labor component.
And what about those renewable resources too? All of those, we don't want to pay them a lot, but also at the same time, we need to have those Teslas and all that stuff. We're just making those small electric components and those easy to make factories. Yes.
I guess that's the way it is. This article is about Garden is one of the few racially integrated parts of the prison where people can come together and take pride in their work. Yeah, it seems to be really transformative. So there's a lot of kind of a strange place to find hope, you might say. Now, of course, she was doing this project on the gardening and incarceration, and then we had COVID-19 hits. And, you know, in general, the people in prisons and in incarcerated situations were in some senses already prepared because they'd already been thinking about these things. This is already an issue whenever you have disease transmission in such an environment. But with COVID-19, it was pretty bad. It was especially in California, there were already overcrowded conditions. You then had, she talks about how there were various transfers that were made before the testing was good, and so people would get transferred into different places, and then if you tested positive, you were put into solitary confinement, which is, I mean, you know, what can you do? But it's pretty brutal. It was very brutal, and you know, and so, you know, obviously this affects the incarcerated themselves. But Tori, who else gets affected in these kinds of things?
Also, just the community in general that surrounds the prison.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge industry, and we locate these prisons in places, and then people work in the prisons, and so the staff, of course, are also exposed, and so they get exposed, but the staff have families in the community around them, and so not only does this affect the incarcerated, and so, you know, I mean, it was a huge issue, and it was not very talked about. And a couple of you said that this was kind of news. Tori, you speculated that maybe this was news. We didn't know about this because it was way off in California where the wildflowers are and where the flowers are blooming. And here in New York, what did we think about?
Well, we had the COVID people going into nursing homes and all those people being infected.
Yeah, so in New York, I guess the main story has been that of the nursing homes and people in those kinds of environments. And so you speculated that maybe this happened in California, and that's why we don't know about it. The truth of the matter is, though, it was a huge problem in New York. Huge problem. I mean, how to say, it was a massive issue, and it was let to run rampant. This is an article from The Nation, which is admittedly a politicized publication, but it's pretty common knowledge that, or it should be common knowledge that it was run rampant in prisons. Why don't we know about the conditions of the incarcerated and what happened under COVID-19? And it's surprising to us that we know these things. As Lara notes, when we look at the overall figures of incarceration, and some people use the term mass incarceration, which is technically true. I mean, it's technically true that the US has incarceration rates and numbers and figures which are simply unbelievable. They're unheard of among industrialized countries, really among any countries. It's a system which has never been seen before, these kinds of rates of incarceration. But she says when we just call it mass incarceration, it implies that we would all know somebody that's in prison. And I guess if it were as a percentage, if we all knew somebody that were in the prison system, maybe we'd know something more about what happens there, but it's not really mass incarceration. I think she correctly describes it as a hyper incarceration of specific demographics, namely people of color and poor people. And so it's not that it's a mass incarceration, although the numbers are massive. It's that in certain groups, they become hyper incarcerated. And part of it has to do with, I guess, again, another connection to the war on drugs, as you may know, the mandatory sentencing, the harshening of sentences, the fact that people are serving prison terms for things that, you know, hopefully this has been reduced a little bit, but other people are taking legally. And so, you know, certain demographics, certain people get hyper incarcerated, and certain demographics do know people in prison and do care and do this kind of work and are very interested in things like gardening. So, you know, I mean, I think we don't know, many of us in New York don't know about what happened in the incarcerated people in New York because very few people give a damn. So, one of the things that Lara is drawing upon, and she cites Ruth Wilson Gilmore all throughout this chapter, and kind of appears at the beginning, middle, and end, a real pioneer in the literature on abolition. Abolition of what, Autumn? Abolition of the prison system, right? Abolition of the prison system. Abolition, you know. Yeah. I don't know. This is kind of like the slogan, "We too are pests." I mean, I've heard from the polling out there that slogans like "defund the police" are not faring very well among the public. And abolition, we gets a positive reading, I guess, when we think about back in the day, 100 years ago, or enslavement. But I don't think this is getting a very good take in today's world. Anyway, Ruth Wilson Gilmore points out at the end that it's not going to be enough to simply point out the flaws of the system or the facts or the hyper incarceration, that somehow from within the system you have to grow different kinds of possibilities. And that's what she's trying to say about the prison gardens, to make different things possible that seem impossible from inside and linked to the outside, so that people, when they finally are able to leave the conditions of incarceration, have something else to do and look forward to. And she says that certainly in the times of COVID-19, when access to these gardens were restricted, people had to work on them even if they didn't know what was going to happen. So I think what she's saying is that it may seem like a small thing or a trivial thing to be talking about people growing their own food and having these flowers and gardens within a prison, but it's crucially important to have something besides abolition meaning simply the end of something. But it can't just mean the end of something, it has to mean the possibility of something else, some other form of society.